have my glasses.
So nice to see you all again.
My beloved
Got it. Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. The technology gremlins paid a little visit to us this morning, so we're just a few minutes late, but we'll give Padma an extra 10 minutes at the end of everything. Welcome back. How are we doing? We good? Great. Great. It just feels that way. You guys have such wonderful energy. I wanted to tell you that we have comment card boxes at the back of the pavilion, and we love to hear whatever you have to say, so leave us a note or come find us. Very much want to hear your feedback. I also want to give a shout out to the terrific booksellers that we get to work with. Yes. Locally, it's Iconoclast Books in Haley and Chapter 1 here in Ketchum, and they carry our presenters' books all years, and they're fantastic. And they also have satellite bookstores going at the Argus Theater for all the live streaming that we're doing over there. So we're just delighted to have it as part of the family. Also running our Big Tent bookstore is Boise State University. They're incredible partners to us. They take all of the profits from the conference and put it into their scholarship program. So they've raised over $100,000 over the last couple of years. You guys are good shoppers. And we have two fellows here from Boise State, and that scholarship fund helps to fund them to come spend the conference with the writers. So they're fantastic. I also want to tell you about a special program that may not be quite as visible to all of you, and that is our Writing Fellows program. You know, we have dreamt about how to make this experience more available to writers who are just coming into their talents, and how to make it more inclusive and a little bit broader. And we envisioned finding a handful of aspiring writers who could come and spend time with these brilliant and established writers here at the conference. We have 8 of them this summer, and their boss is Abigail Gonda. She chooses them through an application process. Where are you? There's Abigail. Fabulous job, Abigail. It's wonderful to have them with us. And you've been running it soup to nuts, so congratulations. Again, none of this would be possible without all of you. Okay, it's my pleasure now to introduce Ann Taylor Fleming, and she's going to bring on Padma and Aleksandra. Thank you.
You can't hear me? You can hear me. As I've said before, my father said you could hear me without a microphone. I'm going to cut myself a little short because I know you're all interested in getting to Padma. We had a slight glitch out there. I just want to say that you are welcome to join what we're considering to be sort of a literary feast. You all know Padma from her show, Top Chef. I hope a lot of you have seen her other show, Taste the Nation, one of my real favorite shows, and if you haven't, go look for it. She traveled all over the country and introduced us to cuisines of indigenous and immigrant people. And as I said to her backstage, for any of you who grew up in the 50s, 60s on those desiccated pork chops with that cottony white bread, the food is a revelation. Padma is also the author of a wonderful memoir. I think it's up there, Love, Loss, and What We Ate. And I said to her, I consider you a sort of revolutionary in the food world. She has expanded our palates and the way we look at cuisine, and reminds us that we are bound by the meals that we share with each other, friends, family, lovers, even people we don't particularly like. So she's going to share her origin story, her life in food with another great food writer I think you all know, Aleksandra Crapanzano, and they will be here, and then I think that we have time to take answers. So, one thing I have to mention. In 2023, Padma Lakshmi was in Sports Illustrated and also a visiting scholar at MIT. Here is Padma Lakshmi and Aleksandra Crapanzano. Of course. Sure.
Thank you.
This is going to be fun. I'm excited. We're going to talk about this amazing book which you just saw on screen, which is Padma's memoir. But we're also going to just talk about life and food and love and all those good things. Now, this memoir is infused with just heady doses of food, of travel, of love, of grief, of dresses, which we can get to later, and in the words of the great Michelle Obama, becoming. Really becoming a woman, becoming a professional food person in this world. But there's also this incredible story behind this memoir, which is that you set out not to write a memoir, but to write a cookbook about clean eating.
Yeah, it's the origin story of this book is actually odd. I was commissioned to write a book about healthy eating, always using the very personal details of my own life to illustrate my philosophies about food, which, in haiku form are basically that no one diet is right for everyone. In fact, no one diet is right for even the same person at different stages of their life. And we were going to use the stages of my life as a way to explain this in detail. And as I was writing, I found myself more drawn to writing about all of those personal stories. There's a bit of memoir in all of my other work in the cookbooks or in articles I've written, but I love memoirs, let me just say that. And but I didn't set out to write a memoir. And I don't know that had I known or started out thinking this was a memoir, that it would have turned out the way it is. I mean, I was re-listening to it this morning because I think Aleksandra now knows more details about this book than I remember, but because she is who she is. And I thought, God, this needs another edit. I would have cut out a lot of stuff, but, people seem to like it. And so I'm very thankful for that. I'm really cursed with that. I'm cursed with good taste because I love memoirs, from Joan Didion to Mary Carr to, The Light of the World by Elizabeth Alexander and Frank McCourt's Angela's Ashes. And those were sort of some of my totems. So it was very difficult to write. It really was. I was thinking of what Judy Blume said yesterday, where you have the critic and, some fear. And I had all those things, but then this rainbow of really brilliant people that also were in my mind. And I thought, so in a way, maybe it's good. I didn't think I was going to write a memoir because maybe I would have never done it. So, there you are. I kind of went backwards into it, and which is why the memoir has a lot of things about my professional career and in great specificity, from being a model to then, other stages of my life.
It's beautiful. It's a beautiful book. It is raw and vulnerable and wise and a real Bildungsroman also. So at the nexus of this book, it strikes me that there is an incredible grandmother, mother, daughter theme going on. And you had an amazing grandmother. Tell us about your grandmother.
Yeah, I was raised also by my grandparents. My mother had an arranged marriage, which was very turbulent, to say the least. So she separated from my father when I was 1, and she moved to America when I was 2, leaving me behind with my grandparents. So I didn't see either of my parents from the ages of 2 to 4. In fact, I've never really seen my real father until well into adulthood, and only once. But my grandmother was a wonderful, wonderful woman. She just passed a couple of years ago. She was one of 17 children. Yeah. And she was one of the older children. And so she helped take care of a lot of her younger siblings. And as she put it, she wasn't one of the pretty ones. So her younger sister got all the dance lessons and did go on to become a very famous Bharatanatyam dancer. But my grandmother was a really wonderful teacher. And so she started the first Montessori school in Tanjore in Tamil Nadu, South India, where her family is from. And then she moved to Delhi with another sister. And at that time, this is incredibly intrepid. You know, she taught sixth grade and fifth grade in New Delhi. And then she got a letter from her father saying it was time to get married. And there was no time to lose because she was 29. So she forcibly went back home, you know, back to Tanjore, and she met my grandfather, who was already widowed from his first wife and had 3 children who were all very close to teenagehood. And, you know, her whole life she was always taking care of kids. So when she came down to South India, she quit her job, but she soon started to organize an orphanage in our neighborhood in South India. And she, after organizing the small orphanage, which is still there, she then got a few doctors that she knew in the neighborhood to start a mobile inoculation unit. So they had this van and they would go into poor slums around the city of Madras and inoculate very, you know, small children to make sure everybody was inoculated. And so she always was somebody who kept really, really busy. And I grew up between her home in South India and my mother's home, which was a studio apartment on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and then in Queens as well, in Elmhurst.
So before, let me just pause for a second here, because there's this incredible story you're skipping, which is, you know, you were born in New Delhi, and at 2, your mother left, which you said, but then at 4, you were sent by yourself all the way to JFK.
Yes,
Like Paddington Bear in a red.
Yes, kind of like Paddington Bear. It's true. You know, you could never do this today, but in 1974, you could. I basically had on this red coat with a hood and a big bow, sort of white and plaid bow, sort of all wrapped up. And inside my jacket, I had a laminated card which said, "If lost, please." I'm not kidding. I wish I still had it. Please return to, and it had 2 addresses. My mother's in New York, and it said "or" in big letters. My grandfather's address in New Delhi, where he was stationed. He was a civil engineer for the Indian government. And I had this pinned. And, you know, my mother must have bought a really inexpensive flight, because I'll tell you the route on, I think it was Pan Am or Air India, but it was New Delhi to Cairo, to Rome, to London.
Oh my God.
With a long layover where I just sat there for hours and hours with obviously no internet, and then, or iPad, and then to New York. And I was very excited. You know, I would wait every day on the outside compound, the fence, between 2 and 4 of my grandparents' apartment building, and they would say, "Come on, it's late, let's go inside." I would say, No, I'm waiting for my ma. She's going to come back from America. She's gone there to work. So that's what they had told me, that your mother's going to office in America and she'll be back. And then they said, "No, you're going to her." You know, so when I got there, my mother was there with a friend of hers. She had this crocheted blanket draped around her arm. I'll never forget it. It was yellow and brown, because she was afraid I would be cold coming from India. I, you know, really didn't wear shoes until I was 4. I mean, you know, I just played around, and it was a wonderful experience. I will tell you quickly that I arrived on Halloween Day, which is a wonderful day for a new child to arrive in America. Yes. And my mother gave me a very quick tour of her little apartment, you know, and she had this beautiful tray of candy laid out, which I assumed was all for me. And then the doorbell kept ringing. And, you know, these kids, she opened the door and there were all these kids. They were dressed really strangely. And, you know, in India, we have street urchins who, you know, dress up and dance for money and all this stuff. So, and they kept opening these bags. And my mother kept tossing my candy into their bags. And I was like, I just got here. And just coincidentally, my mother had actually arrived on Halloween night too, you know, 2 years prior to me. So, you know, she knew how I felt. And I remember walking around, even in the ride to the house, I remember seeing all these kids running around. Those days you could trick or treat in Manhattan. And, you know, once she explained it to me, I thought, wow, America, this land of plenty where all you have to do is dress up and they give you candy. Handfuls and handfuls of candy. I thought, I am in paradise. So that is the story of me coming. That's the origin story of me coming to America.
And then you had so much of a taste already for great flavor, for spice, for real food, and you were a vegetarian.
Yes, I was a lacto-vegetarian until my adolescence. You know, and American high school kind of did me in, but I found it very difficult to eat in America, even in a wonderful city like New York, where we had a lot of different foods. And, you know, I just couldn't stand it. I wasn't going to eat meat. It turned my stomach when I went to the store. When I went grocery shopping with my mother, we would avoid the meat aisle because I would literally feel nauseous to see, you know, whatever the cuts of meat were. And so really, we could only go to Chinese restaurants or Mexican restaurants. There was this, I remember 2nd Avenue had a restaurant called Mañana, which if anyone is old enough to remember New York in the 70s, you may have heard of. And that was because they served rice or something like plain rice. And so I would often ask for a bottle of Tabasco and some soy sauce if we were in a Chinese restaurant, because I could doctor up that soy sauce and make it taste like something. And I remember I would have to ask my mother to order it, because when I would ask the waitress for Tabasco, because I knew that bottle, I mean, by the second time I went, I was like, I can't eat this shit without some Tabasco in it. So the, you know, wait staff would just look at me like I was crazy, you know, because why would you give a child Tabasco? I mean, I was still 4. But that was how I got along. And, you know, because of this, my mother would pack my lunch, or if she couldn't, she took bagfuls of Campbell's soup that were vegetarian. There were only 3 kinds of vegetarian soup back then. There was cream of mushroom, there was cream of potato, and there was vegetarian vegetable, which was the vegetarian version of alphabet soup, which I loved. And she would take that to my babysitter, if she, you know, that I would come home and eat with, who was this Peruvian lovely woman. Or she would pack my lunch. And, you know, because my mother worked as a registered nurse, she was an oncology nurse at Sloan Kettering, she didn't have a lot of time. So it was often just leftovers. Leftovers put in empty plastic butter containers or yogurt containers. And this is the last thing you want to bring to the school cafeteria in 1976, 77, 82. You know, you can imagine. And Indian food is pungent, and it's not particularly attractive. A lot of it, especially home cooking, is brown or some shade of brown, you know, and it was, let's just leave it at that. And you can imagine how cruel kids were. And I'm sure many immigrants from all over the world have this experience. And I think all of those very odd, eccentric experiences really formed who I was very early on.
And it was the 1970s in New York, as you said, and you described it once as a giant block party.
Yes.
Right? That there was this vibrancy and these pretzels and hot dogs with yellow mustard.
Oh, yeah,
which we
yeah.
came back to, and you were roller skating?
Yes. When I was 9, I got a pair of roller skates. And I thought I had died and gone to heaven. I would skate in front of my apartment building every day after school for the 3.5 hours it took for my mom to come home from work. And I had much more freedom. You know, this is 70s parenting, right? So I had much more freedom than I would give my own daughter today at 9. And I would roller skate all over the city. And we lived then on 81st and York, and she worked at 69th and 1st. And so in the summers, I was a latchkey kid, and I usually went to India every summer for 3 months just to give her a break. And also, my mother was very scared that I would lose my culture. So I did spend 25% of my whole childhood in South India, in my grandparents' home, with 8 other people in a 2-room house. And, I will tell you that those 2 existences, those 2 atmospheres were so different. And we'll get to that, I guess, in a second. But the first things I could eat on my own were a slice of pizza, which was 75 cents, and a pretzel, which was a quarter. And my mom and I would salivate seeing other people eat hot dogs with sauerkraut and ketchup and mustard and relish and onions. And so we would ask the hot dog vendor if he could make us a hot dog with all the fixings except for the hot dog.
I love it.
I swear, and it's pretty delicious. I have to tell you. I mean, it can. If you're not used to it, obviously, it feels like something big is missing. But for us, we didn't know that, and we couldn't imagine eating a hot dog. And I was convinced that a hot dog was actually the anatomy of a dog. Oh. And so I was, for years. And nobody could change my mind about this because I had seen dogs. So, I was really afraid of them. But that's how we did it. We just made our way. And then in the 80s, with the advent of the Sizzler salad bar, we were in heaven. There were so many options, and we would just pile our plates high with an all-you-can-eat salad bar with chickpeas and beets and, all of these things. But I think one of the reasons I do know how to cook and learned quite early is because I was a latchkey kid, and I would help my mother stand at her elbow in our tiny little kitchen. And then also in India, so it's just me and my mom in this small apartment until she remarried, and then we went off to Elmhurst, Queens, in another slightly bigger apartment in an immigrant enclave in Elmhurst. But for 3 months a year and certain years of my life. So I studied all of 3rd grade and a good portion of 4th grade also in India. I would live with my grandparents, and, most Indian families, middle-class Indian families, live in joint extended families. So in that 2-bedroom apartment, which is probably no more than 1,100 square feet, we had my grandparents, me and my Aunt Neela, who's like a sister because she's very close in age. She was my grandmother's real daughter. And then we had my uncle and his wife in another bedroom with their 2 kids. And then everybody came and dropped off their kids at my grandparents' house. And so we'd always have a few cousins sleeping on the floor on bedding in the living room too. And my grandmother cooked all the food for all these people with the help of her daughter-in-law and anybody else who was there, for about 8 to 10 or whatever people on a 2-burner stove. And so there was cooking all day long. And another thing, my grandmother never saw a fridge. She only got a fridge when my mom bought her one in 1977, and by then she was already in her mid to late 30s. And she didn't really know what to do with a fridge. Also, it was the size of a dorm fridge. So she usually just used it to keep ice water because, ice and ice water in those days were a miracle, even in South India. And literally, we got our first television in 1978. My mother bought one for my grandfather when he turned 60. And so these are the 2 households I grew up. One where I was just left to do whatever the heck I wanted. And the other one where I had absolutely no privacy. And neither did my grandparents, because me and my aunt slept on the floor of their bedroom. In bedding, we would roll up and just shove under their bed before school.
Did you feel different in each place, or did you feel like Padma just going back and forth?
I felt I was pushing to the front different aspects of who I was, even as a little girl. I mean, most immigrants will confirm that there was a big measure of code switching, and a lot of teenagers do it anyway. You aren't with your friends how you are with your parents. But I had a much more extreme version of that. And after a few years, around 5th or 6th grade, I just didn't feel Indian enough when I was in India. I always had this kind of cool cachet because I was this girl from America, and I would bring peanut butter and Pringles and Donna Summer records, to Madras, and CoverGirl cosmetics, all this stuff. And then in America, because of the way I ate, because of my funny name, and other than those years we spent in Elmhurst, I didn't really grow up in immigrant enclaves. I did grow up in mostly immigrant neighborhoods, but they were Mexican immigrant neighborhoods, Filipino immigrants, things like that. But I was never Indian enough in one place and never American enough in another place, although I am a product of the American school system, basically. So in my head, I feel very American. And if I called, AT&T or whatever and said I was having a problem and I said my name was, Jane Smith, you wouldn't necessarily know the difference. Except that every time I get on the phone with my mom, even for 5 minutes, I suddenly have an Indian accent. It's just so pretentious, and I don't mean it to be, but I have this thing where I can easily mimic the sound, the cadence of the person I'm talking to. And I think it's also born out of trying to assimilate and trying to help people pronounce my name. So I wind up mispronouncing my name a lot, just so people give me what I need quickly and I can move throughout my day.
How do you mispronounce it, out of curiosity?
Padma Lakshmi.
Okay. Ian, and one other thing just on that is you said the most incredible thing yesterday. You said you feel more Indian at home, even inside your own home here, than you do outside your home. Which is interesting.
I mean,
today.
I'm an American, right? I feel very American. I feel incredibly patriotic. I mean, Taste the Nation is a whole endeavor of my patriotism, but I'm still in my deepest core Indian. So where it comes out is when I'm home. I'm a very secular person, but I still have a prayer cabinet, and I still light incense every day, especially on the days that my daughter Krishna has an exam, or I have some important meeting. You still have to remove your shoes when you come into our house. At home, we eat Indian food probably 5 out of 7 nights. Unless I'm testing a cookbook, in which case we eat all kinds of crazy stuff. I listen to Indian music. One of the things I made my daughter do, for 6 years, she had classical Carnatic vocal lessons, and I just sold it to her because she wanted to be a singer by saying you'll have an edge over other, young girls in America who are singing because you'll have this whole nother genre. So unfortunately, I was not able to teach my daughter Tamil or Hindi, but she's also biracial. And she lives in America, which means she's only a little bit Indian and practical. It's hard to compete with, this dominant culture. But she can sing beautifully in Sanskrit, which frankly I can't do because I grew up here, and so I didn't have the privilege of those music lessons that all of my family went through for years. I mean, we had a vocal teacher play the harmonium in our living room for 2 hours twice a week for 20 years, because classical music was so important to my grandfather. And, in those days when I was a toddler, I could sing in Malayalam, which is a Kerala language. I can't speak a word of Malayalam now, but I was quadrilingual. I mean, I speak other languages now, much better than actually some of my Indian languages, but...
Let's talk about all of these cities, and food, because there's New Delhi, there's Madras, there's New York, Los Angeles, Paris, Milan. We talked a little bit about India.
Yeah, London, Madrid,
And London and Madrid, sorry. Add all the languages. No, it's incredible. And, you went to high school in Los Angeles. Now, Los Angeles, it must have had a huge influence on you in kind of leaping to do Taste the Nation.
It did. It really did. I mean, I think having to translate my culture to all of my peers or even their parents when I went to their house was good training. And growing up in the San Gabriel Valley, I, as I said, had many friends who were Mexican, Filipino, Korean, Chinese, black, white. And I would go to their homes and I would eat what they ate, and then they would come to my home and eat some of what I ate, So I know. So I kind of spent my life trying to market different foods to people that I wanted to entice to be closer to, to make friends. And so, growing up, though, in the 80s, I didn't see a lot of that food on TV. My mother never got cable until I went to college, so that was a bummer, but I did watch a lot of PBS, and so I would watch Julia Child, I would watch Graham Kerr, I would watch, The Frugal Gourmet, and that was a show I loved, leaving aside some of the problems with Jeff that we learned about later. I was just, as a child, I loved the idea that he would pick a country and he would cook the foods from that country. And as he was doing that, I think it was produced by Public Television San Francisco or something, he would tell you all about Spain's history, per se. So he would make paella, and he would tell you what tapas were, and he would talk about San Sebastian versus Barcelona, and he would say, 1492 was a very important country because the Jews were being expelled and the Moors were there, and Ferdinand and Isabella came in, and, Columbus came back with tomatoes. And it taught me history. It taught me about food that I had no idea about. And it made me, even though he didn't necessarily speak about Indian food that I remember, it made me feel less alone, because even though I felt very other, he was talking about others that were other to me, and making them seem really interesting and delicious and glamorous. And, I've always loved to cook. I always hung out in my grandmother's kitchen. That was always where the action was. That was where all the gossip was exchanged. That was where all the important decisions were made. And my grandmother, as I said, was very no-nonsense. So there was a real strict hierarchy to what you could cook and when. So, first you were allowed only to break the ends off beans, or peel potatoes, or grate coconut, manually. And then you grew up, and then, once you kind of had your period or something, you could make tea. You could finally turn on the stove. I'm not kidding. And so, I was sort of at the fringes of the kitchen, and my grandmother would close the kitchen door and lock it. She would put the bolt on, and she had this large ring of keys that she tucked into her sari. And some days she would forget to lock it. She would just put the lock on, and it would hang there. And India was so hot. My grandparents were retired by then, so they would all nap. And I would come home from school, and I would tiptoe into the kitchen. And I always had a palate for really different kinds of foods and spicy foods that you wouldn't give to a child. So then I started to climb like a monkey on top of these shelves in my grandmother's little pantry. And I would, take pickles and put them in bowls, and I would just lick these hot pickles, these condiments. And one day I was up there, and I grabbed its, bottle, and then it was slick with oil, and then suddenly it slipped and it broke and it shattered, and there was glass and oil and spices and chilies all over the kitchen floor. And I was just hanging there, terrified, because I thought, oh shit, now what do I do? I didn't want to jump down because I was afraid I was going to slip and really literally just step on broken glass. And I knew that if I called for help, I was going to be in deep shit. And so I just hung there, and then I think I just made some noise or maybe dropped something else, and my aunt came out and found me. And needless to say, she was so angry. And so she put some rags on the floor and then got me down. And then, I think made me also clean up the whole mess, which took a long, long time. So this was my childhood.
I love it. Thank God you're okay. There's a scene in this book that I absolutely love, because I love Paris and I love cheese, of you going to a cheesemonger in Paris.
Oh, yeah. So I was a financial aid student, and after I finished my theater degree, I started modeling. I was discovered my last semester in Madrid by an agent who saw me. And so I've modeled a little bit, but I went back, got my degree, and, I had a degree in American Lit and theater, so I was qualified to do pretty much nothing. And so, I thought I would be a drama teacher, or I would be a substitute teacher to start or something. And so I moved back in with my mom, and then I, met an agent who flew me to Europe. And so when I was in Paris, I was extremely broke. I lived in a model's apartment with 5 other girls, often who were drunk a lot and pissed in the bed in the living room that I was supposed to sleep on. Yeah, very glamorous. And I had no money. And, when you're sort of indentured to the modeling agency, they pay for your ticket, and then they give you a stipend. And the first time you get a job, they pay themselves back. So even if you start working, which is very hard because I had a very long 6-inch scar on my arm, but I was empowered to try and model because I had been able to do so in Madrid. And that is how I paid off my college loans. But that first year, I didn't have any money. And so even to buy a baguette with ham and cheese or eggs or whatever, it was like 10 francs or something. It was a lot. So what I would do, I lived in the Bastille section, and they had a beautiful farmer's market with all the things you would expect in a teeming French market like that. And there was this huge trailer, and there was this cheesemonger that I eventually made friends with, who was really, really big and corpulent and tall. And he was, behind the counter up in this trailer. And to me, he looked like Alfred Hitchcock. Or, just a huge man. And he was just pate of shiny, bald head. And, I could not see where his chin stopped and his chest started. There were no collarbones. I think he was just like this. So he almost looked like a monument, when you're a kid and you look up at a monument. And it was crowded, and there were all these French housewives, and I didn't know how to pronounce anything, and I wanted to taste stuff so I could fill up a little bit by tasting different samples for free. And then he would get sick of me, and he would tell me to go away. But then he, after a while, he saw that what he made me taste, I actually bought. And so they would have a basket with just heels of cheese that were remnants of what they didn't sell, wrapped in plastic for like 2 francs or 3 francs. And so I would buy that, and then I would go to the Moroccan olive guy, and I would buy a bag of oily, chili, briny olives. And then I would buy, at the end of the day, a couple of baguettes, and I would make my own sandwich, and I would press the olives into the bread and pour the oil on there so that the day-old bread wouldn't be so dry. And I would slice my cheese up, and I lived on bread and cheese and olives for probably the first 3 months or 4 months I was in Paris. And then I found out that one of my theater professors was on sabbatical. And so I would go to eat at his house, and I had apprenticed for his wife, who was the head of the costume department in my theater department. And so I knew Kathy, and I would always go there back and forth. But I was spending something like an exorbitant amount, like 1,000 francs or something a month for this, piss-laden mattress, really. And so eventually they just asked me to come and live with them. And I slept on their couch, which at least was not piss-laden. And it was wonderful. It was a great way to have my first year in Paris. It was a tall building which was owned by a literary critic of Le Monde. And he was a great cook, and he had crazy hair, and he had all this African art in his place. On another floor lived an opera singer who he was having an affair with, and his wife just seemed to look the other way. And then on the floor below that, there was a German poet who was the handyman of the whole building. And there was me. And, I was modeling, and it was lovely, the soul-crushing experience of being a model and holding your little portfolio. And in those days I had a little red book called the Plan de Paris, where you would look up everything, riding the subway, and then being in a line with 200 girls, and you would finally get up there, and they would just look, and they weren't even looking, and they would say, okay, whatever. And I felt like saying, I have a degree in theater, and I have done a thesis on the golden age of Spanish. They didn't give a shit. It was just like, so, but then I would go home, and I would have this beautiful experience with Michael Michael Spingler, and my first cookbook is dedicated to him. And through Michael, I learned he was a great, great cook. He was working on a book on Moliere as well during the sabbatical, and he, taught me all the principles of European cooking technique. And so from my grandmother schooling me for all those years about when to use spices, why some spices are healthy, why you don't mix certain spices, why you add certain spices that you don't even taste in the dish, but that they buffer your stomach and they balance some of the acidity in other spices. I paired that with everything that Michael taught me, and that is the culinary school that I had. I didn't ever go to culinary school, nor have I ever worked as a chef, though I have worked in the back of restaurants.
I love it. There was a moment, too, where you, it was really hard to find cilantro in those days.
Yes.
You found cilantro.
Yes, in Paris in the 90s, you could not find fresh coriander or cilantro, and there was one street in the north of Paris that was a Chinese street, and, I can go to Chanel and come out empty-handed, but in an ethnic market, I come home with all kinds of strange seeds and twigs and whatever. So I couldn't help it. I'd gone to a casting. It had gone as dismally as it usually does. And then I walked through this street and I spied it up top and sort of underneath some muslin, but I could tell what it was. And I was so excited. And those days we didn't have cell phones. So I asked him how much it was, and I went to call Michael, and I said, I found cilantro. I said, what are we having for dinner? He said, we're having lamb shanks. And I said, how about we have lamb shanks with a cilantro chutney? He said, okay, go get it, kiddo. We'll do it. And it's just like the smell of cilantro, fresh cilantro, I cannot tell you the joy that it brought. And it wasn't even something conscious that I thought, just my whole body tingled with a happiness that I hadn't experienced for so long. And Michael was great, and he let me cook and, and bring all the things. And eventually, somebody came and did bring me spices, and we managed to cook with that. And, it was a wonderful way as a young woman in my 20s to live. And I'm very thankful because I would never allow my daughter to go into modeling because of all the things that happened to me in modeling. And also, she doesn't need the dough. I needed the dough. And it helped me pay off my college loans. And a lot of that time I also spent in Italy. I lived in Italy for 6 years in my 20s. And I will say that as a young person, I really bloomed there. The Italian people that I encountered really were so open and almost adopted me like an honorary daughter. And I learned Italian very quickly. It was very easy to learn it from the 4 months that I'd talked myself into this study abroad program my last semester because I was bored at Clark, and I took a beginning Spanish program in Madrid. And so based on my 4 months of Spanish, I could learn Italian, and I got to know all the cab drivers in Milan. So I spoke like a cab driver at first, but it was great. It's a great way to know the city and all its ins and outs and really understand a culture. And I really loved living in Italy. It's where I believe I really became a woman. I don't think you're a woman when you're 18 or even when you're 22. At least I can speak for myself and the women in my life. I think it takes time to develop who you are and your sensibility, not only about the world around you, but about who you are, your own sexuality, your own, all of it, right? And so doing it in Europe was great for me because I think when I finally got to Spain and a modeling agent told me he wanted me to model, it was really the first time I felt attractive. I maybe knew I was pretty because my family told me so or whatever, but I worked a ton in Europe, and for many years, I couldn't even get arrested in America because that was not my look. It was the look of Rachel Hunter or, insert Elle Macpherson or whatever. And so in Europe, I felt beautiful. I felt, I was feeling myself after a while, so I really did, beyond the modeling, I think it had a very deep effect on me. And on my own self-esteem and my sense of who I was.
I want to jump to
And then there was Helmet.
and then there was Helmet Newton. Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean it's such a great story.
Yeah. So I went on this casting in about 1994. I'd already been tooling around Paris and Milan for a couple of years by then. And it was with Helmut Newton's agent, Mr. Manfredi, who took these very humiliating Polaroids of me in my bra and underwear to see how I really looked. Armani did that too, by the way. When you went to a casting to be in an Armani show, he gave you a leotard that looked like pantyhose and a pair of heels and a blazer, and you had to walk. And that's how they selected you. But I submitted to this, and nothing happened. And then 6 weeks later, my agent got a call saying, Mr. Newton would like to shoot Ms. Lakshmi. And, I have a really, really big scar on my arm, which I got when I was 14 from a car accident. And so I got really good at covering up my own scar. And I did a lot of fashion shows, but I would always do them with long sleeves. And then Helmut found me, and he actually liked the scar, and so he shot me. And that really catapulted my career in a way that was unbelievable overnight. And the same people that were saying no or making me wear long sleeves now wanted to make me wear short sleeves so everybody would know who I was, which taught me at a very young age that standards of beauty are completely arbitrary. And people of power can just decide, editors in magazines, people who do ad campaigns, people who cast TV shows and movies can just decide what it's going to be. And it was a very important lesson, and that's what I mean by gave me a sense of myself and self-esteem. It wasn't just that I started working, but it showed me, how arbitrary it was, really.
Let's talk about Krishna. So, your daughter, who was kind of a miracle. You were told you were probably never going to have a child.
Yeah, I had stage 4 endometriosis, which went undiagnosed for over 2 decades. And when I finally got the help I needed after 5 surgeries, it was a revelation. But I was told I couldn't have children. It made me very angry because I had access to health insurance, and I had always lived in a metro area where I had access to good doctors, and yet I slipped through the cracks. And so I started a foundation with my surgeon called the Endometriosis Foundation of America, and we started that 15 years ago. And I think my good karma for starting that foundation was that I got knocked up. And believe me, if you read the memoir, you know all the juicy details, but I would not have had a child in this manner. But I did, and I was so happy I was pregnant. It didn't matter that I was single. It didn't matter that all the gossip columns were trying to figure out who the hell the father was. I didn't give a shit. I was pregnant, and I had this low-level hormonal buzz the whole time I was pregnant. I didn't have any morning sickness, nothing. I could have probably used a touch of morning sickness because I gained almost 50 pounds, but I was so happy to have Krishna. And, as I said, I'm very Indian in my home, so where my Indianness comes out most is in my parenting. And I am, lenient in some ways, but I'm very strict about other things. And one of the things I'm strict about is her diet. And we were filming the finale of Top Chef when she was just 4 or 5 months old in Singapore. It was close enough to Madras that I could just hop a plane after and show my grandmother my daughter and all my family who hadn't met her yet. And in Hindu culture, we have a ceremony called an Annaprasanam. And an Annaprasanam is the first food ceremony. So it's the first solid food that a baby eats. And until then, she had only had, she was only breastfed. Sometimes when I was filming, I would have to top her up with formula, but mostly she only had that. And she actually didn't have any animal products until she was after a year old. I only gave her soy yogurt. But when we were in Singapore, I would just tool around Singapore on my time off because I wanted to eat everything in a Cybex, like a baby Bjorn. And we were at this food court that was famous for this dim sum, and it was crowded, and I was with my, immediate 4 or 5 members of my crew, and we were having some dumpling soup, and she was here facing outward. And, by the way, my family's a very orthodox Hindu family. That's why I was a lacto-vegetarian. You couldn't even bring eggs into the house until much later, and you still can't even bring a sandwich if it's wrapped, if it has any meat product in my house, still to this day. So I was having this noodle soup which had beef broth with a Chinese ceramic spoon, and I was very careful not to hit her head with, hot broth. And so I was going like this, and her little face was going like this the whole time. And I kept going, no, sweetheart, no. So then I got a bottle that I had, and I was trying to put the bottle in her mouth while I was trying to eat the soup like this, and she kept turning her face away from the milk and kept following my spoon. And I didn't know what to do. And my assistant on set, Jason, was also there. And, I was and I had the soup, and he said something to me, and she actually went like this and started trying to lick and eat the soup. And I thought, I'm going to Hindu hell. Whatever that is, I am not going to reincarnate up because of this. The first food, she's about to go to her first food ceremony in Madras, like days later. And yet I have ruined everything now by giving her the blood and, distilled sinew of an animal, of a cow, no less. And I felt incredibly, incredibly guilty. And, I just felt horrible. And I sort of, at the same time, I'm eating in front of my child, depriving her of something she clearly wants. So I was like, okay, well, it's done now. So I let her have a sip of the broth. And it was a food court in a mall. It was not your organic homemade broth either, This child has had nothing so far except my milk. And so my assistant, who's always very practical, said, just don't say anything. Said it never happened. What happened? It never happened. It's days before your plane. Her mouth is going to be completely clean. And so I never said anything. And then when I got home, like I said, nobody lets you cook until, you're much older, because cooking is the most important job in the home. And when I got there, by the way, I am the host of Top Chef by this point. I've written 2 cookbooks and a bunch of articles and all that stuff. But in my home, they never let me cook, because if you ask my family, they'd be like, yeah, maybe she's a good cook, but we don't know, because they always do the Indian food. And then when I'm at home, of course, none of my friends want me to cook anything but Indian food. But anyway, so they were all treating me like a child. They were like, do this, do that. And because I didn't grow up in India, I wasn't steeped in all of the steps of every ritual. So, I knew I had to use my right hand. I had to be fed all the Sanskrit prayers in sound bites, that I had to say. I was told which sari to wear. And I was just sort of infantilized at the moment where I felt most adult and most together in my life. So, we made her the lentils and rice. She ate them. I'm happy to say my daughter is a nice, robust eater of many things.
I love it. Okay, we do not have, we only have 10 minutes. Oh no. Okay. Let's jump to a couple things that I know everybody wants to hear. Favorite restaurants?
Oh, okay. So I have a few favorite restaurants in Bombay, Mumbai. You should try to go to Trishna, which is a seafood restaurant. Don't say you want it spicy, even if you like spicy food. Just do yourself a favor and just say you like it mild or moderate. In Ibiza, there's a beautiful restaurant called Las Dos Lunas, which is actually an Italian restaurant, but they grow all their own vegetables. It's a beautiful garden, and it's lovely. What else? God, blanking now. In
New York?
In New York, I like old school restaurants like Danielle sometimes, when you really want everything perfect. But downtown, I like a wonderful restaurant called La Mercerie in my neighborhood. I still love Indochine. It's a glamorous room. The food is consistent. You can eat delicious food while still eating healthy. And the waitstaff always looks, I don't know, they look like they should be, on the cover of a magazine, and they have these full skirts, and they dress however eccentrically they want to. And so I like that restaurant. There's so many restaurants to name, my gosh.
I know. Favorite?
In Milan, Il Rigolo, which is in the Solferino neighborhood.
Is that where you used to have the curry lasagna?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So they made this weird dish called curry lasagna at this Tuscan restaurant in one of the oldest restaurants in Milan, like I said, in the neighborhood of Brera and Via Solferino. It's been there for, now 70 years. And they always would try to get me to eat it. And I did a few times, but that's not what I always ordered.
No, no.
But Indian food and Italian food do pair together. And I know fusion food gets a bad rap, and we don't really have time to go into that, but there are ways to do it which make a lot of sense. And it's also now trickled down to immigrant culture and third cuisine, or the third culture cuisine, which is what I'm currently working on, which is a cookbook version of Taste the Nation, which is a show about immigrant food and culture and politics.
I think we're out of time. But just one last thing, because this is a literary festival. Favorite food books?
Favorite food books.
Yeah.
I was too young to read them when they appeared in the New Yorker, but Bud Trillin has a great anthology called The Tummy Trilogy, and that, I think, has made such a big imprint on how I approach writing. I read it way before I was in food. The Art of Eating, or How to Cook a Wolf by M.F.K. Fisher. There's so many wonderful books.
And food movies?
Food movies. Tampopo. Who's watched Tampopo? Anybody? Great. Yeah. I love that movie so much. Eat, Drink, Man, Woman. The Taste of Things. I've only watched the first half of it, and nothing happens except the cooking, but it's wonderful too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. That was great. I feel like we could talk for another hour.
Thank you, Padma. Padma and Aleksandra will be signing books up at the Big Tent, and we'll see you back soon. Thank you so much. That was just wonderful.